A disrespectful tourist relentlessly mocked a royal guard, testing his patience with every insult. But what the crowd didn't know, this tourist was actually an undercover commander. And when the guard finally reacted, everyone was left speechless. Here's what happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So, subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The morning mist still clung to the grounds of St. James's Palace as Commander Andrew Thornhill adjusted his gaudy Hawaiian shirt and baseball cap, attire he wouldn't be caught dead wearing under normal circumstances. 23 years of military service had earned him the right to command the Queen's Guard, but recent reports of confrontations between his men and increasingly belligerent tourists had prompted this unorthodox approach. If he wanted to truly understand what his guards faced, he needed to become the very thing he despised, a disrespectful tourist. "Time to see what you're made of, Corporal Harrington," he muttered under his breath, studying the solitary figure standing at attention before the palace gate. Even from this distance, Thornhill could appreciate the immaculate presentation of Corporal James Harrington's uniform. Each crease razor-sharp, each brass button gleaming in the early sun. At 27, Harrington was one of his most promising guards, with 2 tours in Afghanistan already under his belt. Thornhill's American accent, practiced meticulously for weeks, rolled off his tongue with surprising ease as he approached. "Well, would you look at that? An honest-to-goodness toy soldier." He made sure his voice carried to the surrounding tourists, several of whom turned with expressions ranging from embarrassment to curiosity. Harrington remained perfectly still, his disciplined gaze fixed forward, exactly as his training demanded. Not a flicker of recognition crossed his face at the sound of his commander's disguised voice, precisely as Thornhill had expected. Drawing closer, Thornhill raised his expensive camera, deliberately stepping beyond the acceptable boundaries. "Hey folks, watch this. Let's see how close we can get before Buckingham Barbie here does something." Several nearby tourists shuffled uncomfortably, a mother pulling her young son closer to her side. Thornhill snapped photos from inappropriately close range, the camera's artificial shutter sound breaking the respectful quiet that had surrounded the guard post. "You gotta wonder if they're even real people under all that fancy dress," he commented loudly to nobody in particular. "I mean, do they go to the bathroom? Do they blink? My kids' action figures show more life." An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket frowned, taking a half step forward before his wife placed a restraining hand on his arm. Thornhill noted the interaction from the corner of his eye, exactly the sort of tension his guards faced daily. "What do you think, buddy?" Thornhill addressed Harrington directly now, moving into his peripheral vision. "Must be a pretty cushy job just standing around all day while people take your picture. Like being a model, except without having to diet. Am I right?" Not a muscle moved in Harrington's face. The discipline was impressive, even to Thornhill, who had helped train him. Behind that stoic expression, Thornhill knew a keen mind was assessing the situation, recognizing potential threats, calculating responses should this tourist cross the line from annoying to dangerous. "Look at this uniform," Thornhill continued, circling like a shark sensing blood. "All dressed up with nowhere to go. Back home, our soldiers actually do things. You know, real military stuff, not just standing around looking pretty for the tourists." A young couple whispered to each other in French, clearly uncomfortable with the Americans' behavior. A tour group leader urged her charges to move along more quickly, recognizing the brewing confrontation. Yet others lingered, that universal human fascination with potential conflict, keeping them rooted to the spot. Thornhill checked his watch discreetly. Phase 1, complete. Minor provocations. No reaction. Exactly as protocol dictated. Now, to escalate, and see if Harrington's training truly held under more significant pressure. The commander felt a twinge of guilt as he prepared his next barrage of insults. This was a young man he respected, after all, but better to be tested by a commanding officer than truly threatened by someone with malicious intent. "Hey, statue boy," he called out, his voice hardening slightly. "Didn't your mother ever teach you it's rude to ignore people? Or is that fancy hat cutting off circulation to your brain?" A few onlookers gasped at the personal nature of the insult. Harrington's eyes remained fixed forward, his posture perfect. But Thornhill, with years of experience reading his men, caught the almost imperceptible tightening of the corporal's jaw, the first hairline crack in the facade. "You folks ever wonder why they need these guys anymore?" Thornhill projected his voice to the widening circle of onlookers, his practiced American accent growing more pronounced. "I mean, we're allies and everything, but back home, our military is actually functional. You know, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, real soldiers doing real jobs." Harrington remained motionless, though Thornhill detected the subtle shift in his breathing pattern. Measured, controlled, the kind of breathing techniques they taught to maintain composure under fire. "Good lad. Hey, buddy, what was your combat experience like? Oh, wait." Thornhill snapped his fingers with exaggerated realization. "Standing still doesn't count as combat, does it?" He circled closer, invading the invisible boundary most respectful tourists observed. "Did they pick you for this job because you were too scared to actually fight? Is this where they put the soldiers who can't hack it in real combat zones?" A muscle in Harrington's cheek twitched almost imperceptibly. Thornhill knew the insult had struck its mark. Harrington had earned a commendation for valour during his second Afghanistan tour, pulling 2 wounded comrades to safety under heavy fire. "I bet if I checked under all this fancy dress-up, I wouldn't find a single combat medal, would I?" Thornhill continued, his voice carrying just enough to ensure Harrington caught every carefully chosen word. "Probably just some ribbons for best dressed, or excellent posture or something." An older man with a military bearing stepped forward slightly from the crowd. Thornhill noted his straight posture and observant eyes, military, almost certainly, though not in uniform. The man whispered something to his companion, his gaze never leaving the unfolding scene. Thornhill filed the observation away. This man might recognize something wasn't quite right about this particular tourist. "You know what the difference is between you guys and the statues in Madame Tussauds?" Thornhill asked loudly, gesturing toward Harrington. "The wax figures have more personality." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, quickly stifled by disapproving glances. A young woman with an American accent spoke up. "Sir, please stop. You're embarrassing us." Her cheeks flushed with genuine mortification as she clutched her guidebook tighter. "Just having a little fun, sweetheart," Thornhill replied without looking at her. "Don't you want to see if these guys are real? I heard they're actually robots. The British can't afford real soldiers anymore, so they built these mechanical guards to fool the tourists." The educated absurdity of the claim was designed to irritate rather than be believed. Thornhill stepped even closer to Harrington, close enough now that he could see the controlled pattern of the guard's breathing, the disciplined stillness of his eyes. "Seriously, though, what do they even teach you guys?" Thornhill's voice dropped slightly, becoming more targeted, more personal. "Stand still, look pretty, let tourists make fun of you? What kind of military training is that? In the American Armed Forces, we learn to actually defend our country, not just decorate it." The military-looking observer shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. Thornhill noticed and adjusted his approach slightly. This man was reading the situation too well. "I'll tell you what I think," Thornhill announced to the crowd, though his eyes remained fixed on Harrington. "I think this whole setup is just to distract from the fact that Britain's not a real military power anymore. All pomp, no circumstance. Am I right?" He laughed at his own joke, a sound engineered to grate on every nerve. A father pulled his young son away, murmuring, "That's not how we behave, Timothy. That man is being very disrespectful." The lesson in the negative was not lost on the boy, who looked back with wide eyes. Thornhill checked his watch again, 20 minutes in, and Harrington was holding firm. Time to transition to more personal attacks. The commander felt another pang of regret for what he was putting his soldier through, but he needed to know, would Harrington maintain protocol even when pushed to his absolute limit? "Let me guess," Thornhill said, stepping directly into Harrington's line of sight, his voice dropping to ensure only the guard and those closest could hear. "Couldn't get a real job, could you? Couldn't hack it in civilian life, so you settled for playing dress-up for tourists. That's the real story, isn't it, soldier boy?" Time to get personal. "You know, I've been reading about you British Guards," Thornhill began, his tone shifting to something more cutting. "Did you know they pick the slowest, dimmest recruits for this job? The ones who can't be trusted with actual military responsibility?" He directed this falsehood straight at Harrington, whose eyes remained fixed forward despite the barb. A young woman with a British accent stepped forward. "That's absolutely not true. These guards are elite soldiers with—" "Elite at what, sweetheart? Standing still?" Thornhill cut her off with practiced rudeness. "Look at him! If this were a real soldier, he'd have something to say about how I'm talking to him and you." He gestured dismissively at Harrington's immaculate uniform. "All dressed up with no wars to fight. The British military in a nutshell, folks." The woman's face flushed with anger as she retreated, murmuring something about awful Americans that Thornhill pretended not to hear. Good. He needed the crowd properly agitated for the next phase. Stepping directly in front of Harrington now, Thornhill lowered his voice to an intimate level. "Let's talk soldier to soldier, shall we? Though calling you a soldier might be generous." He adjusted his stance, deliberately mimicking the posture of a drill instructor. "Your boots aren't properly polished. There's a thread loose on your left epaulette. Your bearskin cap is tilted 2 degrees off-centre." None of these things were true, of course. Harrington's turnout was immaculate, as always, but Thornhill knew from experience how these precise criticisms could burrow under a soldier's skin, especially one as dedicated as Harrington. "I bet your commanding officer would be ashamed if he saw you now," Thornhill continued, his voice still low, but carrying just far enough. "Standing here, letting some tourist walk all over you. No backbone, no initiative, just a hollow uniform with a man-shaped void inside it." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Harrington's eyes. Not recognition, but a deeper response to the challenge of his professional pride. Thornhill had seen that look before in training exercises, when a soldier was pushed nearly to breaking point. Perfect. "The thing about you British military types," Thornhill raised his voice again, playing once more to the crowd, "is that you're still living in the past. World War II was your last real moment of glory, and you've been coasting on it ever since. These guards, this palace, it's all just a museum exhibit of what British power used to be." The military observer's posture had changed subtly. He was watching Thornhill with increased intensity, his head tilted slightly as if reassessing what he was seeing. Thornhill would need to be careful. This man was picking up on something. "Tell me," Thornhill moved closer to Harrington, invading his personal space now, "did they assign you this post because you failed at everything else? Is this where they put the soldiers who can't be trusted with actual responsibilities? The ones who couldn't hack it in Afghanistan or Iraq?" Harrington's nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Thornhill's words had found their mark. This was no theatrical jab. Thornhill knew from Harrington's file that the corporal had requested a second tour in Afghanistan after losing a close friend during his first deployment. The young guard had distinguished himself repeatedly in combat situations that would have broken lesser men. "I mean, just look at you!" Thornhill circled Harrington like a predator, his voice dripping with manufactured contempt. "Standing here like a statue while real soldiers are out there doing the work that matters. Do you ever wonder if you're wasting your life? If all that training was for nothing more than becoming a tourist attraction?" A child's voice piped up from the crowd. "Mummy, why is that man being so mean to the guard?" "Because some people have no respect, darling," came the mother's reply, loud enough for Thornhill to hear. And no proper upbringing, apparently. Thornhill ignored them, focusing entirely on Harrington now. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to ensure his next words were for the guard alone. What would your mates from your unit think if they could see you now? The ones who didn't make it back? Do you think they'd be proud to see what you've become? A prop? A decoration? A toy soldier? It was a cruel blow, deliberately so. Thornhill needed to know how far Harrington could be pushed before protocol broke down. In the field, during real operations, soldiers faced provocations far worse than verbal abuse. If discipline cracked here, how would it hold under genuine pressure? Harrington's breathing remained measured, but there was a new tension in his jaw, the accumulating strain of maintaining perfect composure under a barrage of personal attacks. Thornhill nodded slightly to himself. Time for the final phase. You know what I've always wondered about you guard types? Thornhill projected his voice with theatrical disdain. Whether all this fancy equipment actually works? He gestured to Harrington's ceremonial rifle. Is that thing even loaded, or is it just another prop in this elaborate charade? The military observer took a half step forward, then stopped, his weathered face revealing growing suspicion. Thornhill noted the movement in his peripheral vision, but kept his focus on Harrington. The corporal's discipline remained impeccable, though a vein now pulsed visibly at his temple, evidence of the extraordinary restraint he was exercising. I bet if I'd just... Thornhill deliberately let the sentence hang unfinished as he moved closer, allowing the implication to register with both Harrington and the increasingly concerned onlookers. He positioned himself directly before the guard, conscious that his next action would test not just Harrington's discipline, but the entire protocol system that governed these situations. With calculated slowness, Thornhill raised his hand toward Harrington's rifle, not grabbing it. Even in this role, he wouldn't go that far, but reaching out as if contemplating whether to touch the sacred weapon. His fingers hovered inches from the polished wood and metal, close enough that Harrington could feel the line being crossed. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Everyone present knew that interfering with a Queen's Guard or their equipment was strictly forbidden. Would it really matter if I just took a closer look? Thornhill's voice had changed, carrying a more dangerous edge. What could you actually do about it? Stand there and watch like the glorified mannequin you are? Harrington's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, to Thornhill's approaching hand, then back to their fixed position. It was the smallest break in protocol, but to Thornhill it spoke volumes. Harrington was processing the potential threat, calculating his response options while maintaining his ceremonial pose. "Sir," a palace security officer, had noticed the escalating situation and was moving swiftly toward them. "Step away from the guard immediately." Thornhill ignored him, keeping his focus entirely on Harrington. "Your commanding officer would be so disappointed," he murmured, just loud enough for the guard to hear, "standing there uselessly while some tourist makes a mockery of everything you're supposed to be protecting. Is this really what all that training was for?" The security officer was closing in quickly. Thornhill had perhaps 10 seconds before the intervention would disrupt his test. He pressed on, fingers still hovering near the rifle. "What would you do if I were a real threat?" he challenged, voice dropping to ensure only Harrington could hear him clearly. "If I weren't just some annoying tourist, but someone who meant actual harm, would you stand there like a statue until it was too late?" The military observer had edged closer, his posture suggesting he was prepared to intervene if necessary. His companion was tugging at his sleeve, trying to restrain him, but the man's eyes never left Thornhill's face. There was recognition dawning there. Not of Thornhill specifically, but of the situation. This observer understood something wasn't right about this tourist. "Your commanding officer would have you on latrine duty for a month if he saw this pathetic display," Thornhill continued, his voice carrying just the right mixture of contempt and challenge. "Standing here, letting me get this close, this threatening, without even a twitch of response, is that what passes for soldiering in the Queen's Guard?" Harrington's eyes met Thornhill's for the briefest moment, a microscopic break in protocol that spoke volumes to his commander. There was something in that momentary connection, something beyond the strict adherence to rules. A question, perhaps, a suspicion beginning to form. The security officer was just steps away now. Thornhill made his final move, stepping so close that his breath would be felt on Harrington's face. His hand moved closer to the rifle, not quite touching it, but creating the unmistakable impression that he might. The crowd fell completely silent, the tension stretching like an over-tightened wire about to snap. "What if I told you," Thornhill whispered, his lips barely moving, "that I know exactly what would happen if I touched this rifle? That I know precisely how you've been trained to respond? Would that surprise you, Corporal Harrington?" There it was, the slightest widening of Harrington's eyes at the use of his rank and name, a crack in the perfect statue's facade. "What would your commanding officer say," Thornhill delivered his final jab, "if he saw how useless you are right now, how you're standing here like an overpaid mannequin while a potential threat is inches from your weapon?" The security officer reached them, his hand extended toward Thornhill's shoulder. "Sir, I must insist you step back immediately, or you will be—" Before he could finish, before his hand could make contact, something unexpected happened. Harrington blinked. A deliberate, slow blink that no one but Thornhill would recognize as the covert signal used between commanding officers and their men in undercover operations. Recognition had dawned. The moment had arrived. The crowd held its collective breath as Corporal Harrington's ceremonial stillness dissolved, not into uncontrolled rage as many had expected, but into the crisp, deliberate movement of military precision. His rifle snapped to attention position with a sharp crack that made several onlookers jump. "Step back, sir." Harrington's voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. His eyes now locked directly onto Thornhill's, protocol abandoned for something more immediate. "As you well know, Commander, interference with a Queen's Guard is strictly prohibited." A ripple of confusion moved through the gathered tourists. "Commander?" The security officer froze mid-reach, his training conflicting with this unexpected break in procedure. "Corporal, what's happening? Do you know this man?" A smile spread slowly across Thornhill's face as he straightened his posture, the slouching American tourist persona falling away like a discarded coat. When he spoke again, his natural accent returned, crisp, authoritative, undeniably British. "Commander Andrew Thornhill, Queen's Guard. I believe you can stand down, officer." He reached into his garish shirt pocket and produced an identification card that made the security officer's eyes widen in recognition. Harrington snapped to attention and delivered a perfect salute. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted, Corporal." Thornhill returned the salute with equal precision. "With all due respect, sir," Harrington's voice remained controlled, but a hint of emotion crept in. "That was completely unfair. Using Adams's name was below the belt, even for a readiness test." Thornhill nodded once, acknowledging the criticism. "Noted, Corporal, and precisely why it was necessary. A real threat won't play fair either." He turned to address the bewildered crowd, his commander's voice carrying effortlessly across the courtyard. "Ladies and gentlemen, please accept my sincere apologies for the disruption. What you've just witnessed was an operational readiness test, not a genuine confrontation." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the spectators. The military observer stepped forward, his suspicions confirmed. "Royal Marines, retired, thought something wasn't right about your approach." He extended a hand to Thornhill. "Too methodical for a drunk tourist, too knowledgeable about military protocol for a civilian." Thornhill shook the offered hand, a flash of professional recognition passing between them. "Sharp observation, sir. We've had increased incidents of guards being harassed. I needed to understand firsthand what my men face and how our protocols hold up under extreme provocation." A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mummy, was the mean man actually a good guy?" The question carried clearly in the courtyard, drawing a wave of nervous laughter from the crowd. Thornhill turned toward the child, his expression softening. "Not mean, young man. Testing. Sometimes we need to test the things that matter most to make sure they're strong enough." He looked back at Harrington, genuine pride evident in his expression. "And I'm pleased to say that Corporal Harrington demonstrated exceptional restraint and judgment." Harrington maintained his formal posture, but couldn't quite suppress a flicker of satisfaction at the commendation. "Thank you, sir, though I admit there were moments when protocol seemed insufficient." "That's precisely the point, Corporal." Thornhill addressed not just Harrington, but the entire gathering. "These guards are not ceremonial figures. They are active duty soldiers with combat experience, operating under protocols designed to balance ceremonial duties with genuine security concerns." The retired Marine nodded in agreement. "Most people don't realize these lads could be patrolling in Afghanistan 1 month and standing guard here the next. Same training, same soldiers, different duties." Thornhill surveyed the crowd, noting how their perspectives had visibly shifted. What had begun as an uncomfortable spectacle of disrespect had transformed into an educational moment. The truth about the guards, their training, their purpose, their dual role as both ceremonial figures and active protection, was being absorbed by dozens of international visitors who would carry that understanding home with them. "The uniform is ceremonial," Thornhill concluded, his commander's voice carrying the weight of generations. "The soldier wearing it is not." Corporal Harrington had resumed his post, his posture perfect once more, though his eyes now occasionally scanned the crowd, the subtle shift in protocol acknowledging that sometimes security concerns outweighed tradition. "Corporal Harrington," Thornhill called, "would you explain to our visitors why you maintained your composure despite extreme provocation?" Harrington's response was precise, his voice carrying the confidence of a soldier who knew his purpose. "Our protocol exists for a reason, sir. Breaking stance for every provocation would compromise centuries of tradition and, more importantly, our effectiveness as a security force. Our ceremonial stillness is not weakness, it's discipline." Thornhill nodded approvingly. "And at what point did you recognize this was a test?" A hint of a smile touched Harrington's otherwise stoic expression. "When you mentioned Adams, sir, Lieutenant Adams was my commanding officer in Afghanistan. No tourist would know that connection." "Precisely." Thornhill addressed the crowd again. "The true test wasn't whether Corporal Harrington would maintain protocol indefinitely. It was whether he could recognize when breaking protocol became necessary. Security sometimes trumps ceremony, but making that judgment requires exceptional discipline." A young girl of perhaps 10 years raised her hand. Her mother tried to lower it, but Thornhill nodded to her encouragingly. "Does it hurt?" she asked, standing still for so long. The unexpected question drew gentle laughter, but Thornhill treated it with complete seriousness. "An excellent question, young lady. Corporal, would you care to answer?" Harrington addressed the child directly, his formal manner softening slightly. "Yes, miss. It can be quite uncomfortable, especially in extreme weather. We train extensively to manage the discomfort. The uniform alone weighs nearly 16 pounds, and during summer ceremonies, guards occasionally faint from heat exhaustion." "Then why do it?" the girl asked, her face scrunched in genuine confusion. "Because some traditions are worth preserving," Harrington replied without hesitation. "Because the discomfort reminds us of the greater sacrifices made by those who came before us. And because discipline in discomfort prepares us for discipline under fire, which has saved lives on the battlefield." The retired Marine nodded approvingly. "Well said, Corporal." Thornhill stepped forward again. "There's another dimension to today's exercise that may not be immediately apparent. The increasing confrontations our guards face are not merely annoying, they're potentially dangerous. When tourists attempt to distract or provoke a guard, they may inadvertently create security vulnerabilities." He gestured to the palace behind them. "These guards aren't standing here for your entertainment or photographs. They're protecting sovereign ground, historical treasures, and sometimes members of the royal family. What looks like harmless fun to a visitor can create genuine security concerns." The security officer, who had attempted to intervene earlier, added, "We've had incidents where guards were physically accosted or where tourists attempted to touch their weapons. Beyond being disrespectful, these actions can trigger necessary but disruptive security responses." Thornhill surveyed the crowd, noting how their expressions had shifted from initial shock to genuine interest and understanding. "The next time you visit one of our historic sites, remember, the guards you see are not wax figures or tourist attractions. They are combat soldiers performing an important duty, one that balances ceremony and security, tradition and vigilance. The stillness you observe isn't emptiness. It's restraint, discipline and professionalism of the highest order." He turned to Harrington, pride evident in his bearing. "Carry on, Corporal. You've done yourself and your regiment proud today." What would you have done in Corporal Harrington's position? Could you maintain such discipline when faced with personal attacks? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you a new perspective on Royal Guards, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories, and press the bell icon for notifications. Check out our other videos appearing on screen now, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time with a brand new story. Remember, true respect comes from understanding, not just observation.